Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I'm in Clerkenwell today, a corner of London just outside the old city walls. The area started life as home to two monastic settlements, the Priory of St John and the Nunnery of St Mary's. Later it became a hotbed of political revolutionaries, and as is often the case, much of that seditious talk went on in the local pubs. I've covered some of the southern end of Clerkenwell before in a video on Smithfield. I'll put a link to that up there, wherever that goes. An advance word of warning though, this is practically ground zero for gastro-pubification. The Eagle, arguably the first ever gastropub, is here in Clerkenwell, and I think it's fair to say at least some of the pubs we're going to be seeing today have gone at least a little bit in that direction. So without further ado, pub number one, here on Clerkenwell Green, the Crown Tavern. Cheers from the Crown. A 19th century building in stock brick with some classical detailing. The first floor windows have curved pediments. There's a shadow of an old sign at the corner of the building, and we'll come back to that later. Some nice tiling in three tones of tiles beneath the windows on the ground floor. A run of pilasters along the ground floor with Ionic capitals. And there is this very nice beer garden out the front spilling onto Clerkenwell Green. Inside it's a mixture of some older elements and some more modern elements. I think actually being there in person, it was a little bit nicer than I was expecting from having looked at the photos on Google Maps beforehand. The bar counter is today painted in what I would assume to be a... Oh dear. It's a bit windy. Had to put all the umbrellas down because it was a bit too windy. The bar counter today is presented in what I suppose is a sort of shabby chic style with paint half peeling off. But actually, on inspecting that more closely, I wonder if that could even be Victorian. It preserves some of the presumably original Victorian layout of the two bar rooms. There is a distinction between the public bar and the saloon bar that you can see in a jutting out section of that bar counter. There's possibly some remnants of old-ish fixtures in the bar back. There's some bits of carved dark wood, a bit difficult to see with all the other stuff in front of that. And there is a remnant of a partition going across what is now the opened up bar room. And interestingly, in the upper levels of that small fraction of what used to be the partition, there's a run of snob screens. Really unusual to see them at that height, so presumably they're a transplant from possibly even the bar counter of this pub or possibly the bar counter of another pub at some point in time. There's wood panelling around much of the walls, some nice cornicing in places as well, and a Victorian fireplace or two. Probably though the most notable and most talked about feature of this pub's interior is the old conspirators' clock. The old conspirators' clock has a date of 1683 on it. Hard to say for sure whether it is a genuine piece of that significant antiquity or a more modern recreation. This is associated with not just one but two different historical episodes. Firstly, the Rye House plot of 1683, a conspiracy to assassinate King Charles II and his brother, the Duke of York. Secondly, there is a claim on possibly shaky grounds that this was the spot underneath this clock where Lenin and Stalin first met in 1905. That first meeting is also attributed to the Tampere conference in the same year, so we need to take all of this with a pinch of salt. Around the corner from here is the, I think today called the Marx Memorial Library, which apparently is a building where Lenin worked during his stay here in London. The Crown goes back to at least the 18th century, and the earliest written record I could find of it is this account from 1795 of a meeting of local residents here at the Crown. This was in the wake of an attack on George III by an angry mob who surrounded his coach. At this meeting, the residents wanted to present a dutiful and loyal address to His Majesty expressive of their sorrow for the daring outrage lately committed against His Majesty's person. I can't help but think, given the reputation Clerkenwell has for seditious behaviour, that there was an element here of, it wasn't us, Gov. That incident is depicted here, in particular the breaking of the window of George III's carriage. There was some disagreement about the time about the exact nature of the projectile that went through the window there, whether it was a stone or, as some believe, a bullet. A few years later, the Crown appears on Horwood's map of 1799. It's actually labelled, the name of it is written here, quite unusual for individual pubs to be named on that map, and that suggests that it was a pub of some significance at that time. Clerkenwell Green, the space in front of the pub, was a focal point for large public gatherings in the 19th century. The Chartists demonstrated here in 1848 as part of their campaign for political reform, including a demand for universal suffrage, or at least universal male suffrage. The classical building depicted there in that engraving is the Old Sessions House, which still stands today, and that building dates to the 1780s. You can see the Crown in the background of this gathering of the temperance movement in 1872. And you can see Archbishop Manning, who we've encountered before on these videos, on a wagon there giving the pledge. Note the Bass Ale sign on the corner, and I think that accounts for the shadow at the corner of the pub that we still see today. The scene depicted there does make you wonder what sort of a trade the Crown did on that particular day. Today the pub is operated by Mitchells and Butlers, part of their Castle brand, the one they use for more historic pubs. Here is a look at what is on the bar lineup. Unfortunately, my visit was not particularly well timed, and the Hogsback tea, the one that I would have gone for out of those three, was not available, so I've had to go for a half of Guinness instead. Hogsback tea is from Surrey, traditional English ale. It stands for TEA. It's a beer I remember having some years ago and always quite enjoying. Alas, unfortunate timing. Pub number 2, and it's just round the corner from the Crown. It's the Three Kings on Clerkenwell Close. Cheers from the Three Kings. It's not a nationally listed building, but it is on Islington Council's local list, so they have written some notes about it. They believe it to be late 19th century. Looking at the shape of the building on the 1870s Ordnance Survey map, I suspect it was rebuilt sometime after that, because you can't see the curved shape of the frontage at that time. But if we skip forward to the 1890s Ordnance Survey map, you can see the curve that we see today. The local listing from Islington Council doesn't mention the tiling, which is a bit of a shame, because previously this was a completely tiled ground floor frontage. Today it just has green tiles up to the dado level, but there were originally cream tiles higher up. It seems some of the inner panes of glass may also have been lost in that remodelling. I think it was perhaps around 2020. You can see from some old Street View imagery that there used to be Man, Crossman and Paulin brewery livery in the windows. Today the inner parts of the windows are just plain glass, but the outer parts of the windows are actually quite attractive. They almost look like Crittall metal frame windows here, and the outer panes have mottled glass in them. It's in a very nice setting here on Clerkenwell Close, immediately opposite St James's Church, which is on the site of what used to be the St Mary's Nunnery Chapel. I think around that 2020 remodelling of the pub, they also did a refurbishment of the interior, and it does look quite different to how I believe it had looked prior to that. All quite modern today, alas. The name of this pub is interesting, the Three Kings. The Dictionary of Pub Names states that it's usually a biblical reference, usually coming from the Three Kings or the Three Wise Men. I wonder, given the timing here, the first written record that I found of this pub is from the 1770s, if instead it may actually be a reference to the succession of King Georges we had in the 18th century. George I reigned from 1714 to 1727. George II reigned from then until 1760, and George III from then on. So assuming the pub was established sometime after 1760, that would be the most likely explanation to me. The modern sign for the pub has decided to interpret it as King Henry VIII, Elvis and King Kong. That earliest record I found is a 1778 newspaper, at which time they were selling tickets for entertainments at the Sadler's Wells Theatre, which is not too far from here in Clerkenwell. Some heated local parish politics next. There was a contested election for the curacy of nearby St James's Church in 1839, which led to a campaign of posters and broadsides in the parish. The locals split into two factions, the supporters of Reverend Mr Faulkner versus the supporters of Reverend Dr Dillon. I think the supporters of Dr Dillon were using the Three Kings as their campaign headquarters, having previously been ousted from the Crown by their opponents. On Camera's website, they report the operator of the pub as Red Car Pubs Limited. I'm not sure if that's actually up to date, because I think that company might be in the process of being dissolved. So not sure who is currently running this pub. Here's a look at what they had on the beer lineup. Happily, I found Harvey's Sussex Best there, so I'm having a half of that. I'll put the price there on screen. Taking a quick diversion between the Three Kings and the next pub, the Sekforde Arms, by way of the churchyard of St James's here. And I believe these are remnants of the old St Mary's nunnery. These parts of the wall here were possibly part of the cloisters. John Rogers did a very atmospheric video of a walk around Clerkenwell. I think he's actually done a couple now, so I'll put a link up to that wherever that's going to be, explaining a bit more about the history of the local area. Pub number 3, the Sekforde, which I think was formerly known as the Sekforde Arms. Cheers from the Sekforde. This is another corner pub, again in stock brick, and again probably 19th century. It could even be late Georgian. The pub's website seems to suggest that the pub was established in 1829, and possibly even that this is the original building. The ground floor frontage today is in wood, but I believe that only dates to 2015, when there was a major overhaul of the building, and prior to that it had a tiled exterior, and I think for a while it had been a Young's pub possibly. Inside it's all quite polished and all quite smart looking, and there is definitely the whiff of a gastropub, but I would say in their defence at least they've kept the colour palette very neutral. There's not a lot of turquoise paint here, and it is all quite woody, and there's overall a sort of mid 20th century feel to it. You see that particularly in the choice of chairs, and I think some people will probably really warm to this pub. I'm sure it will evoke mixed feelings from those who will say it's a modern recreation versus a genuine piece of mid 20th century interior, but I could see it would have its fans. The bar counter has, to me, an interwar kind of appearance with those rounded corners. And there's also a basement bar room with something in the floor. The pub takes its name from the street. It's on Sekforde Street, and that in turn takes its name from Thomas Sekforde. He had at some time owned some of the surrounding land and was a figure in the court of Queen Elizabeth I. The earliest newspaper mention I could find of the pub was in 1839, and once again it relates to the Chartists. A meeting was held here at the Sekforde Arms to petition for the liberation of William Lovett, who had been imprisoned for his role in the Bullring riots in Birmingham. There's some irony in choosing the pub as the venue for that meeting, as Lovett was also a proponent of temperance. Today the pub is independently owned, and I believe the current owners are the people who did that refurbishment in 2015. There was just one hand pump on the bar, but it was quite an attractive offer for me personally. This is Longman's Best Bitter from Sussex, and I suppose you could say it's slightly in the style, a homage to Harvey's Sussex Best. Pub number 4, and we're back onto Clerkenwell Close once again. This is the Horseshoe. Cheers from the Horseshoe. It's a 2-storey backstreet pub here on Clerkenwell Close, and the ground floor frontage is almost entirely covered by these really lovely mottled glass windows. Quite appealing looking, I think, in this setting amongst these slightly taller Clerkenwell buildings. I think the part which looks like the entire pub building is actually an extension, I read somewhere, from the mid-19th century, and the original pub building is the larger building behind that, which goes back somewhat further. Inside, it's hard to say that there are a lot of old fixtures and fittings here, but there is a very nice effect from the light coming through those mottled glass windows. A bar counter with matchboard panelling that interestingly has a sharp corner at one end but a curved corner at the other end. That curved corner at the other end suggests possibly interwar origins. Darts is apparently a big draw here. I think I read that they have no fewer than 4 dart boards. I think I saw at least 2 of those. And there is also this surprisingly large garden out the back. I think they refer to that sometimes as a secret garden. The Horseshoe is quite a common pub name, and the dictionary of pub names suggests that its popularity may simply be down to the fact that it's easy to draw and easily recognisable, and also it's of course classically a symbol of good luck. I couldn't find any evidence to support this theory, but I wonder if there may have been something like a stable or a blacksmith even on this site previously, and that may be where this specific instance of the name comes from. If you go all the way back to the 17th century, you can see the Duke of Newcastle's London residence at that time here on Clerkenwell Close, and it's typically the case when you get those grand London residences of the nobility here in London that some of the buildings nearby were used for ancillary equestrian purposes. It's another pub which goes back to the 18th century at least. It's mentioned in the Proceedings of the Old Bailey in 1784 with a case of uttering, i.e. forging currency. The pub would have existed in 1799, the time of Horwood's map, and I think it's this building here on the corner with Pear Tree Court. It does appear there are two smaller buildings in front, and I wonder if one of those eventually became the extension which now forms most of the pub frontage today. A newspaper account of 1904, which I found quite surprising, talks of pirated music in connection with this pub. These weren't bootleg phonograph cylinders they were dealing with here. This was pirated sheet music. Surprisingly, the use of the term pirate to mean unauthorized copying of music goes back at least as far as the 1820s. Here's an account of the son of John Wall Calcott, the composer, bringing a complaint against a music seller for selling pirated versions of his father's music. The Horseshoe today is another independent pub. In addition to being well known for its darts, they're also known for their live performances. I think they have performances of jazz and folk music here. Although there were 4 hand pumps, it looked like only 2 were in service, and both of those 2 were serving the same beer. Slightly regret ordering now because it's not really my sort of thing. Is it called Pure Gold? It's a mixture of hops, so it's not entirely grapefruity, but I believe there is a little bit of Citra in the mix. This is a beer I may not finish, I'm afraid. That aside, I think it definitely has a pubby pub feel to it. This is not one that has turned into a gastropub, and if you're a darts fan, this is definitely the pub to come to. Lovely location here on a little back street. I think it's a really nice setting here on Clerkenwell Close. Don't know if you can see that behind me. The guys from Topjaw are filming there. I won't bother asking if they're interested in doing a collab because I think the demographics of our 2 different channels are somewhat different, aren't they? Pub number 5, and we've suddenly gone from a series of really quiet pubs to one that's actually quite busy. This is the Exmouth Arms on the corner of Exmouth Market. Cheers from the Exmouth Arms. I'd say this pub looks neo-Georgian. Interestingly, there is actually a date on the building of 1915, so if that is accurate, this is a very early example of neo-Georgian architecture, at least in terms of pub buildings. They tended to be typically interwar. There's a lot of this very attractive green tiling and some Courage Brewery branding. I think I read somewhere though that the Courage ownership of this pub came a bit later. So originally it had some other breweries livery on it and they've changed that at some point, but I think the actual underlying tiles are original from 1915. I don't know if it's original from that 1915 rebuild, probably not, but I do really like the very colourful stained glass in the upper panes. At one end of the pub there is a nice fireplace surrounded in brick-like mouldings there with a motif on top that looks a bit like the corbels from the windows on the second floor, so I would guess that dates from 1915 as well. Elsewhere it is inevitably a bit modern, but I think at least the exterior of this building is quite a handsome pub. The Exmouth Arms sits today at one end of a street we know as Exmouth Market. That was formerly known as Brains Row at the time of the 1799 map from Horwood, and that was at that time the northern extreme of Clerkenwell. Beyond there was naught but fields. By the time of Greenwood's map of 1828, it has been renamed to Exmouth Street. I think Exmouth Market is a relatively modern affectation. It's claimed on Wikipedia that the street, Exmouth Street, was actually named after the pub. I wasn't able to prove or disprove that either way. The waters are a bit muddied by the fact that in the first half of the 19th century, there were at least 3 different Exmouth Streets around London, and it seems each of them had their own pub called the Exmouth Arms on them. So I think some of the reporting on this pub is actually getting a bit confused by some of those other pubs of the same name on the streets of the same name. Either way, the name Exmouth Arms almost certainly comes from Edward Pellew. He was a naval officer who was made Baron Exmouth in 1816. Today the pub is operated by Urban Pubs and Bars. They're a sort of medium-sized chain. I think they have 40 or so pubs across London. There was just one hand pump in service on the bar. It was Twickenham's Grandstand Session Bitter. I was a little bit sceptical about this. Looked up the hops on the web and it says it's triple hopped with Brewer's Gold. To me there is a little bit of the twang of the grapefruit about that. I can't say I'm hugely enjoying it. I'm not sure I would call that a classic session bitter, but oh well. We are in somewhat hip territory here on Exmouth Market, as I said, having just seen Topjaw filming just down the street. I doubt they'll be talking about what an unusually early example of Neo-Georgian pub architecture the Exmouth Arms is. Pub number 6 and the final stop on today's itinerary, the Shakespeare's Head. Cheers from the Shakespeare's Head. It's written behind me, look. This is an interesting and quite unusual example of a modern pub or a modern rebuild, camera suggests it was 1960, that makes it onto CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors. Although that said, that rebuild date of 1960, possibly slightly contested, Philip Temple's book on Clerkenwell and Islington suggests that it was in fact the 1950s or 1950 itself, so a little bit of debate, but it's definitely post-war. It's one of those flat roof pubs, and it's at a glance one of those places you'd more expect to see on Honest Places, Danny and Co going to, rather than here on Tweedy Pubs. But I do think the interior here is really quite special. As a flat roof pub, there's not a huge amount to say about the exterior. It's red brick and it's somewhat sort of no frills utilitarian, as you would expect a building of that era. That was typical for new built pubs in the, let's call it the 1960s for now. And they're quite often built adjoining two estates. Inside, I think it's actually a bit of a gem. One of the bar counters has an unusual black rusticated brick. And there's also this narrow shelf on top, which is presumably to put your handbag on. It's quite an unusual feature. You don't see a lot of those. Perhaps this is a forerunner of those little hooks you quite often see on bar counters today to try and prevent theft. The bar back, according to camera, is also of the 1960s with typical glass shelving. The other bar counter here has an unusual leatherette padding to it with buttons in. I don't think I've seen a bar counter like that anywhere before in a pub. Those two different styles of bar counter suggest that this was actually divided into two different bar areas, a public bar and a saloon bar, at the time of that possibly 1960 rebuild. And if so, that would make it a really unique and fascinating snapshot into that point in history, because as I've often mentioned before in these videos, it was the 1960s when often the partitions in possibly Victorian, possibly Edwardian, possibly interwar pubs were generally removed and pubs were turned into open plan spaces. The meanings of the public bar versus the saloon bar as a result became less clear. You can still see a bit of a remnant of that separation between the two bar areas, and there is a veneer covered joist perhaps over that with the name of the pub. Elsewhere, fixed banquette seating, quite possibly from the 1960s, with that wonderfully familiar red cushion colour that to me is just quintessentially pubby. I assume the name the Shakespeare's Head here was chosen because of the proximity to Sadler's Wells. There has been a theatre at Sadler's Wells since the 17th century. I think it's something like the 1680s, and it was well known particularly in the mid-19th century for its performance of Shakespeare's plays, which would probably suggest why this pub has taken that name. The pub predates that rebuild of 1960. Here is a newspaper mention of it from 1875. Later in that decade, it was ran by a somewhat shady pair, Mr. and Mrs. Block, who were charged with fraudulent bankruptcy and forgery in Switzerland, suggesting they were possibly using the pub as a front to launder their ill-gotten gains. Today, CAMRA lists the operator as Shaky Limited, but I think that's one of those pub companies that just runs a single pub, effectively. I'm pretty sure this is, in effect, an independent pub. The YouTube channel Britain's Lost and Living Pubs have done, I thought, a very interesting video about this pub, including an interview with the current landlord. 3 generations of his family currently work in the pub, and his family have been at the helm for over 40 years, which I think is really impressive, and I'm sure that is a big part of why we have such a beautifully preserved interior today. One hand pump on the bar serving Courage Best Bitter, which is what I went for. That is going to be it from Clerkenwell from me today. I've now walked to the edge of Islington. You can see the old Angel Hotel behind me there. I think Clerkenwell's a very interesting area historically. It does have some, at least in terms of the exteriors, some quite attractive pubs. The interiors perhaps more of a mixed bag, and maybe also a mixed bag in terms of beer quality from my personal point of view as well. But it was an interesting afternoon spent in a slightly lesser known part of London. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.